today we continue building our 5 stair-step visualizations. And why don't we go ahead and start with the biggest, most complicated one, and then do the easier ones afterward. We might get through all of these today, but if not, that's okay. We'll finish up on Friday. So we talked about how, with the Mutual Film case of 1915, the Supreme Court started itself down the road of creating varying levels of First Amendment protection. The other day we did one of the more complicated ones, which is about by medium. And so today we'll do by type of speech. By type of speech. And so it's the same shape. And of course we achieve these levels by applying different levels of scrutiny. And so you tell me what type of speech gets the highest protection under the First Amendment? No, written is on the other stair step. That's medium. What type of speech?
Political speech.
Political. And why is that?
Because they view it as one of the most important things about the First Amendment is the ability to question the government.
That's right. And more specifically, to criticize the government, right? The First Amendment, when we talk about government of, for, and by the people, and when we talk about, think about this. Think back on the values of free expression handout, right? Which value of free expression tells you that political speech gets the highest protection?
Check on governmental power.
Okay, partly it's check on government power.
Self-government.
Self-government, participation in self-government. Without the First Amendment, we couldn't participate in self-government. The First Amendment is the mechanism by which we participate in self-government. So we're going to say political speech. Political speech is up here, and we're going to assign a case to it. New York Times v. Sullivan, 1964, which we'll talk in depth about in a few weeks, next month. But notice, look how late the date is. It took the Supreme Court all the way to 1964 to say that to articulate the idea that that political speech is the most important type of speech. We call that part of the case, it's called the central meaning portion of the case, when the court talks about how the freedom to talk about politics goes to the central meaning of the First Amendment. And so one thing that it did, if you remember on your big timeline, right, how many sedition acts did we have? 3? What year?
1798, 1861.
Okay, so we had, every time we were in a moment of national crisis, 1798, that was caused by the war between England and France, and Americans were divided about which side of that war they wanted to favor, and the government was contemplating getting involved, and the country was bitterly divided over it. And so we had a Sedition Act, then we had the Civil War, and we had another Sedition Act, and then we had World War I, and we had another Sedition Act. And what is sedition?
Criticizing government.
It's essentially criticizing government, speech that undermines the government, right? Speech that might incite the violence and or the violent overthrow of government. But in all of those cases, we never got to hear from the Supreme Court as far as, is that possible with the First Amendment? And so in the New York Times v. Sullivan, even though it's a libel case, it has nothing to do with sedition, there's a lengthy discussion about the meaning of the First Amendment in the middle of that court case. And this is when the court says in no uncertain terms that to punish people for their speech against the government, to punish you for criticizing the government, cannot be possible under the First Amendment. And so that's why we say one of the 7 innovations of New York Times v. Sullivan that we'll talk about is that the court finally rejects the idea of seditious libel. Rejects the idea of seditious libel. You cannot be punished for criticizing the government. In fact, quite the opposite is true. The First Amendment demands that you criticize the government. All right, so political speech we know is going to be up there. Then, do you remember on your First Amendment timeline, do you have a case called Valentine v. Christensen in 1942? Yeah, okay. But it's, when we went over the PowerPoint slides, the First Amendment PowerPoint slides last week, it came up in the PowerPoint slides. And so if you want to add that to go back to your timeline and add that, Valentine v. Christensen, 1942, on the First Amendment line. Valentine v. Christensen was the very first time that the Supreme Court had anything to say about advertising. And in that case, the Supreme Court said advertising falls below the line of First Amendment protection. And so we're going to say this is the floor of First Amendment protection. The floor of First Amendment protection. Anything that falls below this line is not protected by the First Amendment. And everything that's above the line is protected by the First Amendment. And so in Valentine v. Christensen, the court said advertising falls below the line, meaning it's not even protected by the First Amendment. But, as the court is sometimes wont to do, they changed their mind. So flash forward to 1976. Flash forward to 1976. And the court said, we were wrong. Commercial speech is protected by the First Amendment. Commercial speech is protected by the First Amendment. And they announced that in a case called, you can just call it Virginia Board, because that's what we all call it. Virginia Board, it's Virginia Board of Pharmacy. And so with that case, they did several things. First of all, they struck down Valentine v. Christensen, so that's no longer true. Then, and we can put it right under it, this is kind of neat, right under it, they said, but, so advertising is protected. Doesn't get the same level of protection, but it is protected. But, false, deceptive, or illegal advertising is not protected. False, here, buy this pill, it cures cancer. That's false. Deceptive or illegal, deceptive advertising. Many people who suffer from cancer have bought this pill, and they've been very happy. I could be deceiving you into thinking that it cures it. Or here, illegal. If I advertise, I've got the cheapest reefer in Highland. That's my ad. Right? So none of those things, these are 3 types of advertising that are not protected by the First Amendment. So we have that speech is, but not as high as political, and then we have these 3 types. And so these are our first types. We're going to get more down here, types of speech that are not protected. What's another type of speech that we've talked about a few times that isn't protected?
Never mind. I was gonna say hate speech would be something maybe, yeah.
Hate speech is protected,
Right.
highly
Yeah.
protected. It came up in the quartet of cases in 1919. What was that special type of speech?
Oh,
Insight.
I don't know if I have the right, putting something in danger with your speech, like yelling fire.
Incitement. Incitement. So we might as well go ahead and log that in here too. Incitement.
That would fall under like the middle, or,
Look where I'm putting it.
oh, under.
The floor of First Amendment protection. Incitement. Speech that is likely to incite violence or lawless action. And so we said we can assign a case. Here we've got these types of speech that aren't protected, and the precedent for this is Virginia Board of Pharmacy. The precedent for this, the first of the quartet of cases, 1919, Schenck 1919, and that's where you're thinking of the word danger from the clear and present danger test. The clear and present danger test. That's from Schenck. But now, watch this. So here's our precedent here is Virginia Board. Schenck is the precedent there. And we're going to talk about this more when we talk about how the Civil Rights era changed First Amendment law. But I want you to go ahead and fill in your chart like this so that you've got everything in here. A case called Brandenburg, 1969. Did I spell superseded right? No, I've ever even written that on the board before.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's right. So, Schenck gave us the clear and present danger test, and remember we said that was really weak. It was like, it blew a big hole in the First Amendment. Brandenburg, what you could say Brandenburg did was made it almost impossible to prove incitement. Raised the bar really high. But just for the sake of having our chart complete, Schenck was the precedent, superseded by Brandenburg in 69.
What did Brandenburg do again?
Brandenburg supersedes Schenck, meaning this becomes more important than Schenck. They didn't literally overturn Schenck, but this becomes more important, whereas Schenck left it easy for the government to prove incitement. Brandenburg made it almost impossible for the government to prove incitement. Okay? Now, we also, from the PowerPoint slides, we can log in another. What's the difference between commercial speech and corporate speech? What's the difference between commercial speech and corporate speech?
Well, corporate, because it's supposedly it's a separate entity, so it's a person. Wouldn't corporate have more freedoms? Well, you actually.
Well, you see where they are. They're both right there. They both get equal protection, which is intermediate protection under the First Amendment. But why are there two different categories? What's the difference between those two things?
One's internal, one's external.
What do you mean by that?
Like commercial is like kind of like mass broadcasting, and corporate's more like within the building, like they speak amongst each other.
Kind of. What you could think about is this is your intention, because it's both speech. You're intending to reach an audience, but commercial is you're connecting with external. Just to borrow your language, external in so much as you are proposing a transaction with somebody. buy this brand of fabric softener, or buy this car, right? Commercial speech is speech that proposes a transaction. Corporate speech doesn't propose a transaction, it's just a corporation speaking. We are ExxonMobil, and we think that we have a right to pollute the land, and we don't want the government to regulate us.
So would that be like their opinion on like a political issue or something if they were to
Exactly.
release something?
Exactly, and that's where corporate speech happens the most, and that's where it's the most crucial. We are a corporation. We are against the North Carolina General Assembly regulating fracking in North Carolina. In fact, we think it's a good idea. It's such a good idea that we're going to give millions of dollars to politicians in North Carolina to influence them. And then guess what happened? Then the North Carolina politicians, who the corporations had spoken to, passed a law that made fracking legal in North Carolina a few months ago. What is fracking? Anybody know what fracking is? It's a way of finding oil or natural gas, and then why is it in the news? Destroys people's land, and in particular, destroys the water supply. So here's how corporate speech works. Notice they're not trying to sell you anything. It's the corporation, the oil companies want to speak out, and so they take out ads and things and say, we think fracking is great. We think having water that catches on fire is great. Then they go over to Raleigh and they lobby the state legislators. That's corporate speech. And now, because the court has said so, donating money to a politician's campaign is also considered speech, corporate speech. Right. And why are corporations treated like people? How do you know? Because of the concept of the two-word phrase, the concept of corporate personhood, and it came from what case?
Santa Clara.
The Santa Clara case. What year?
1886.
1886. That's how you think through it. You chunk these things together. So commercial speech, Virginia Board, 1976. Corporate speech, Bellotti is the case, and these are in those PowerPoints. 1978. So you know that Bellotti, the Santa Clara case, lives on the 14th Amendment timeline. So think, and then Bellotti is on the First Amendment timeline. So in other words, the Supreme Court, you try to put it into words. How did we get from Santa Clara on the 14th Amendment timeline and Bellotti on the First Amendment timeline? You see this relationship. Now you're starting to see why we talk a lot about the 14th Amendment, because there's an important relationship. So what did the court say in Santa Clara?
Oh, that corporations have the same rights as like people,
Okay, so they said that, they announced just that general idea.
and then through incorporation, it went to the First Amendment.
You don't even need incorporation, just reason this out. So in Santa Clara, they said corporations will be treated like people, and they have rights. Therefore,
Corporation is the same as a person, they get the First Amendment rights as well.
if a corporation then is treated like a person, it means that they also have First Amendment rights. And so Bellotti is the start. 14th Amendment is the start of treating corporations as people. Bellotti is the start of treating corporations as people, therefore they also have First Amendment rights. And Bellotti, just so you,
So what exactly was the difference between commercial speech and corporate speech?
commercial
sell
speech
something.
tries to sell something.
Right.
Corporate speech isn't trying to sell anything, it's usually political advocacy. Right? Think about this as selling and this as advocating, because it's usually political. And so what we can see then is they started off with this idea that corporations, because they already get 14th Amendment rights, they also get First Amendment rights. Then we had a case called Buckley v. Vallejo in 1986 when corporations started fighting against campaign finance regulations. And they started saying, wait a minute, if we have First Amendment rights, paying money, giving money to a campaign is a kind of speech. Contributing is speech, the court said. Contributing money to a campaign is a kind of speech. And then we can fast forward all the way to someone's going to have to back me up on the date, 2010, I think. Citizens United. Are you on Google? Just say Citizens United Supreme Court, something like that. It'll come up. You see it? Should be in Wikipedia.
Yeah, versus the Federal Election Commission.
Yep. What year?
Argued 2009, decided 2010.
2010. So they took here's the idea that corporations have speech, or that have First Amendment rights, right? So you see how the court builds on ideas. So here they said for the first time that they have First Amendment rights. Hello. It looks like a long story. By your long faces, Sam said it's like a long story. So just come on in. And so here for the first time they say they have First Amendment rights. Here for the first time that they say a corporation giving money equals speech. And then here they took that idea to the nth degree and they struck down as unconstitutional all limits of corporate campaign contributions. Equals no limits to contributing.
So that's what led to our last president took a campaign on $2 billion.
I think it was $2 billion total for Romney and Obama. Somebody could even look at that. Cost of presidential election 2012.
Is there not some sort of tax on corporations? Because I know that person to person, there's like, if you exceed, I think $26,000 a year, there's a gifting tax that
Yeah.
comes into play. Is there something like that for corporations?
It's not treated exactly the same like a gift. It's treated, there are different ways of handling campaign contributions in terms of how they're taxed. But you also need to know that all the large corporations in this country managed to wiggle out of paying any taxes. Last year, I think it was 2 years ago, the statistic was that ExxonMobil had the most profits of any corporation in 1 year in the history of the world, and they paid this in taxes. In fact, they got a refund from our federal government. I paid more in taxes, right? A schmuck like me, I paid more in taxes than ExxonMobil. So the system has been gained over the years. And this is, so, and that, as far as the tax code, so you see, this is called capture. When you have companies or industries that are supposed to be regulated and that sort of thing by the government, over time, they tend to capture the parts of government that are supposed to be regulated. So over the years, they've lobbied congressmen to write the tax code in such a way that favors them. But here's an example of how, so that's a legislative route. The corporations can go the legislative route and lobby Congress to write the tax laws in their favor. They can also take the legislative route at the state level. They can go to our state legislature and get the state legislature to lift the ban on fracking in North Carolina. But here's an example of how they could also go the judiciary route to try to get special favors. So we saw, it took them a while. It took them from 1978 to 2010, but they got what they wanted. No limits, right? Took a while, but they got what they wanted, using the judicial route as well. Okay? Now, what do you think gets the lowest type of protection? Protected, but not very protected. Intuitions? Gut instincts? Action isn't protected by the First Amendment. This is a type of speech that gets a low level of First Amendment protection. What do you think?
Personal speech?
Your personal speech is pretty well protected. Well, let me ask you this. What about child pornography? Is it protected by the First Amendment? No. Because it's something that's illegal. So child pornography is not. But if that's true, then why are there like 1,480,000,000 porn sites on the internet?
Regular porn
It's not child
So child porn is not protected, but normal porn is. So indecent speech is protected. In other words, regular old porn. Whatever that is. And we'll say our case is Miller v. California, 1973. Notice, it was not until 1973 that the court said porn is protected. The government used to regulate porn a lot harder than it did. The government, you may not realize this, but going back into the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the government and state governments and the federal government used to ban all sorts of stuff. Used to ban books, Leaves of Grass, Lady Chatterley's Lover, things like that. They would ban even literature that they thought was obscene. And so there's a distinction to be made here. In 1952, I think I'm right about that, it might be 57, the Supreme Court said that obscene speech, obscenity, falls below the level of First Amendment protection. Maybe you could check me on that stuff. Just do raw obscenity.
50 seconds.
57. Is banned by the First Amendment, is not protected by the First Amendment, meaning the government can ban all of it. Government can do whatever it wants.
You said that came back into that, but that case was before the indecent speech. So.
That's right. So here, the Supreme Court said it's okay for the government to do whatever it wants as far as pornography. It can ban it, it can confiscate it, it can do whatever it wants. Then, in 73, they reconsidered that. And notice these two different decades.
They didn't completely overturn that Roth case, though.
That's exactly right. So that means that they didn't overturn Roth. So that means obscenity still falls below the line. And we'll use child porn as our paradigmatic example of obscenity. So they left Roth in place, then they modified it with Miller and said, even though obscenity, the yucky kind of porn, isn't protected, regular porn is protected.
Is there anything else that falls under indecent other than porn?
No, it's just this distinction, either obscene, which
I didn't know if
isn't,
there was any other kind of indecent speech that was okay.
no, regular porn and child porn. So you either get things that the government or that a court will rule as obscene and it isn't protected, or things that the courts will protect, right? So here, and again, this is one of the reasons why legal scholars don't like the fact that the court created all of these varying levels, because someone in clear and concise language tell me what the difference between indecency and obscenity is. Hmm?
Age. Like
Okay, so it has something, you're saying the distinction, yeah, but what's, okay, yeah, that's the example here. Has to do with age.
Actual words, the difference between.
Yeah, what is the difference?
Indecent would be not accepted by normal society, whereas obscenity would be, like, rejected by almost all society.
That's kind of a good way to do it. You could say, this would be universally rejected by society. This would be rejected by some segments of society, but not rejected by some segments of society.
I googled the definitions, and in the definition for indecent,
Yeah.
obscene is part of it.
Yeah.
It says not conforming with generally accepted standards of behavior or propriety, obscene. And then obscene has decency in it. Of the
Right.
portrayal or description of sexual matters offensive or disgusting by accepted standards of morality and decency.
Right, and so this is why when you read the court opinions, it's just ridiculous, right? To hear the justices talking about what it is. You know, I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. And so now look up the Miller test in the case of Miller v. California. So the court came up with a 3-part test called the Miller test. And listen how tortured the language of this is.
Whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurien's interest, whether the work depicts or describes in patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value.
Right. So it took them a long time to come up with that convoluted sort of test, but what they're basically saying is we, the court, know it when we see it. So anyway, that's how we get those two different types, unprotected porn and protected porn. How am I doing on time? What time do we get out? Oh. So, we've got a few more types of unprotected speech. So what happened was because the Supreme Court made it so hard for the government to prove incitement. In other words, the government is trying to block your speech and it's trying to say, or punish you, and it's trying to say it was incitement. The court made it nearly impossible. So the government started trying to find other litigation strategies. And so we had fighting words, and we had a rather weak case. Look up Chaplinsky is the case, and I want to say it's 1942. So we had, just like with Schenck, we had a case that was rather weak.
1942.
Rather weak. And the government was able to win. It was able to say, those are fighting words. And look up fighting words doctrine. I can't remember whether I had a case that superseded. And then we had truth. Then they started saying, and it became harder. I should have studied before class today. I have a good memory, but it's not flawless.
What do you want to know about fighting?
That's what I was looking for. The RAB case. What year is that?
1992.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. And then in 1992, just like with Brandenburg, made it nearly impossible to prove incitement, RAB made it nearly impossible to prove fighting words. Incitement is when the government claims that your words are going to incite other people to violence. Fighting words is different. It's when you're involved. It's a face-to-face kind of thing. I'm going to kick your ass, right? Fighting words has to be like of them in and of the moment. It has to be a very immediate thing. It can't be it's going to cause violence some other time. And so just as here, where the court said, it isn't good enough for you to speculate that the words might cause violence, you have to prove it. So similarly, they said here, it isn't good enough, government, for you to speculate that these words might lead to a fight. You've got to prove it. And then the government said, okay, we want to suppress this speech because this speech represents true threats. True threats. What they're building on is they're taking the idea from criminal law of communicating threats. Like if we were in a bar argument and I said, I'm going to kick your ass, and they called the cops and the cops arrested me, they could charge me with communicating threats. And so they take that idea and bring it over here and start saying that we can suppress your language or we can punish you for your language if it represents a true threat. And in the early days, can you look that up for me too? I'm losing my dates here. Just do Watts' True Threats. So in the early days, again, like with these, we had a weak decision that left room for the government to accuse people of that. I'm gonna have to look it up later.
No, I'm finding it. I can't. I don't have it on.
It's kind of an obscure case. And then had a more recent case in which, just like with those others, the court made it nearly impossible.
I found one in 1969.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Oh, my Wikipedia helps.
This is on the First Amendment Center.org.
Awesome. FirstAmendmentCenter.org. That's what I like to hear. Okay, so, and you guys all have that bookmark, right? So do you see how these moves go? And it applies here too. Earlier, a weak decision that allowed the government a lot of leeway to regulate porn, then it made it much harder. A weak decision made much harder. A weak decision make it much harder. And notice that you can really see sort of history playing out and seeing how the court, its decisions tend to reflect sort of mainstream society. And so whereas in the 50s people would have said, I don't see anything wrong with the government just regulating porn however they want, by the time we get here, through the era of the 60s and all the various liberation movements of the 60s, we see the court reflecting the fact that mainstream society has accepted the fact that regular porn will be around.
Can you explain the difference between fighting words and true threats?
Yeah, so true threats is just me threatening you. I'm just threatening you.
Okay.
Whereas
Fighting.
fighting words is the way to do the difference here. Incite, I'm going to incite other people to be violent. Fighting words, my words are going to cause a fight right here and now between us.
Okay.
And then true threats would be, I'm just threatening you.
So, like, true threats sounds like a weaker threat than fighting.
Well, if you're worried about incitement of violence, yes. But here, what they've done is they've taken the idea from criminal law
Okay.
that threatening someone can be an illegal act,
Okay.
and brought it over into the First Amendment realm, and said that the First Amendment, this is the government's argument,
Right.
that the First Amendment should not protect threatening language. But of course, by now, we get these later cases that make it very hard for the government. So that's why there are controversial cases, like there was a case It was a website set up by an anti-abortion group. And they made what looked like wanted posters of abortion providers. And I wish I could remember that it's still up. There's a cached version of it, right? And it was like it was inviting people to hurt those people. And sure enough, there were a few murders where anti-abortion people actually shot and killed doctors. And the website would put a big X over that person's face as they were killed. Right? And so that case was argued under this. And it was an unusual one because the government won. Because a lot of people thought that, the court's free speech jurisprudence in this area was so strong, but they agreed with the government in saying that that X's on the face was sort of, that crossed the line to show that it was almost like, you really were threatening violence upon these people. But then the winning part of the argument was it wasn't just speculative, was it? It was really happening, right? It wasn't the government just saying this might happen. It was actually happening. And that really was the linchpin of that decision. These two, let's talk about these a minute. So once again, we have an example when we talk about the story of race in America intersecting with the story of constitutional law in America at an interesting moment. This one had to do with more like regular anti-war protests. But here, these were both cross-burning cases. There were cases where someone burned a cross, and the question was, so we go back to our speech-action dichotomy. Is burning a cross speech that is protected by the First Amendment, or is it action that is not protected by the First Amendment? What do y'all think?
Speech.
See, so we have a divided court. And these two decisions, the court was bitterly divided on both of these. And so the argument is that burning a cross is expressive action, that it's meant to send a message.
How is that any different than burning a flag? Didn't we say that burning a flag was the...
Well, what we said was we're going to have to go and we're going to have to look at the cases because the court, sometimes it feels like a crapshoot. Burning a flag is speech protected by the First Amendment. So says Texas v. Johnson. Burning a draft card, a case that came right around the same time, they said it isn't. They said it's action that isn't protected.
But that's because another law was violated in burning the draft card, right? Like,
Well, that's their rationale. They said that a draft card is government issued property and you destroyed the property of, right? And that there was specifically a rule that said you can't destroy the draft card. So they based the decision on that. But remember, there are rules, norms, and customs about damaging a flag too, right? Desecration of the flag, right? But so they chose in that case to go that way. They chose in that case to go that way. Here, then, the question is, can the town have a law that bans cross burning? And so they could go either way. And they chose to rule in favor of a strong First Amendment protection for expressive action. And Virginia v. Black, Virginia v. Black is interesting. If you look up Virginia v. Black, do you see a split? Like how many justices on one side, how many justices on the other? So in Virginia v. Black, again,
It was 2003.
2003, So the thing is, they have by now a long tradition of classifying certain things that seem like action as speech, and they don't want to weaken that tradition. So we get here, and I believe it was a bitterly divided court, if I'm right. And again, they side with the idea that burning the cross is expressive, therefore it's protected by the First Amendment.
But that was an RAV or a Virginia?
Both of them.
Wait,
In
they,
both of them, they side with the speaker, not the government. In other words, the person who wants to burn the cross and says it is protected by the First Amendment, they side with the cross-burning person. So, if you had to argue the other way, you see it?
7 votes for Virginia, 2 against.
Oh, wow. 2 against. And so Clarence Thomas writes a dissent. Probably the best thing he's ever written. And he'll be remembered for it. And remember, what's the purpose of a dissent? To put your opinion out there. For what purpose? Because there could be future cases when your argument becomes the winning argument. So if you were Clarence Thomas dissenting, and you wanted to lay out a litigation strategy for future cross-burning cases, what would you say? How would you make the argument that burning a cross is not protected by the First Amendment? What do you think? But we know that the incitement argument is just not going to be good because the court's going to cite Brandenburg, and that's where intuitively you would go, right? But you need to stay over here with true threats, right? That burning a cross on the yard of a black family is a true threat, and then how would you reason that out? What threshold questions would you start with to build your argument on? So you'd start with the speech-action dichotomy, and you would argue that this is action, this is not speech. And then how would you do? What's the action that's going on here?
It's a targeted.
So burning a cross.
It's a targeted threat. It's not.
It
that
seems
you're-
targeted.
It's not that you're trying to bring about world peace or make a point to a vast majority. It seems like a targeted, direct act.
You're not trying to speak to many people, right? It's not a general message you're trying to get out. Targeted is a very good word. You are targeting it at a specific person. And why do people generally target their speech at a certain person? It could be to persuade, to intimidate, to whatever. But again, this is an action that is directed at this certain person. And then, there's a nice section where he goes into historian mode, and he talks about the history of burning crosses. Where did burning crosses come from? The KKK, the rise of the Second Klan after Birth of a Nation in 1915. The first Klan didn't do this. But the rise of the Second Klan, and you can talk about that history, and what was the intention of the action of burning a cross? Targeting this certain black family. What's the intention of it? To scare them. Right? To scare them. That sounds like a threat to me. If you're doing something in order to scare someone, doesn't that sound like a threat? And then also in his discussion of the history, there was a close nexus between the burning of a cross and violence. Because what often happened after the burning of the cross? They would hurt or kill the people. Right? So it's a really good dissent. It's really worth reading. But so what you could maybe surmise is that maybe his opinion one day could become, it just depends on society. Because, right, we said that we stipulated that the court tends to follow what society thinks. So it could, 20 years from now, his dissenting opinion could become the majority opinion.
Now, if in REV, it was already stated that burning a cross is protected.
No, that's when they said it.
That's when they said it, right?
Yes.
So then why in Virginia we thought was even an issue? If it was already.
Because the details of the cases were different. They weren't exactly the same. And I'm not real interested in the specific details. It was a slightly different set of facts here than over there. So they went ahead and took the case. I think also, if you look at RAV, is this a bitterly divided court? One of the things that was, I remember some discussion here. Virginia v. Black, they allegedly took because they were trying to clear up some some misunderstandings about this case, but then this case really didn't help. And in fact, in Virginia v. Black, one annoying thing that they do is in the opinion mixes fighting words and true threats, and it sort of makes a mess out of it. But the overall point, we're kind of getting into the weeds and details here, but the overall point is you see these moves by the court allowing a lot of government regulation, not allowing. Allowing a lot of government regulation, not allowing. Allowing a lot, not allowing. And so you see the court hardening its First Amendment doctrine and becoming more and more protective of speech through this series of cases. Because remember, we start with just the good old idea of political speech is highly protected, but then over the years they keep adding other types of speech that are protected.
I think a 5-4 margin.
5-4. Okay, so here we had a bitterly divided court. People were divided over the doctrine. Here they were going to try to clear things up a little bit, but obviously they must have cleared it up some because we've got a 7-2 decision in the middle. Can Mr. Gibson, can you come up and take a picture of this?
Right now? After?
Yeah. You can leave the table. I'll keep talking. So, because I want to go ahead and post all these, it'll be especially important for people who are absent. We have a bunch of people absent today. Awesome, thank you. So let's then move on. It's 12 after, what time did we get out? Okay, we can just add one more simple one. Actually, let's not. Why don't we just break early instead of moving on to another discussion? Yeah, we'll finish up on Friday.